Hey there, it's Tom Jordan. Got a great program today. We are watching a whole slew of issues that are happening right now. Plus, we're going to talk about a couple of economically consequential issues. The likelihood of continued rising costs as a result of a delayed deal with the longshoremen. That strike, it may have been called off last week, but it is a temporary call off as they continue to negotiate, and the issues at hand are not resolved. Also, we're going to talk about the real cost of driving and maintaining an electric vehicle. It is stunningly expensive, with some numbers that just came out a few minutes ago at the top of the hour. Patrick Anderson with Anderson Economic Group is going to join me in a moment to talk about those two consequential issues. And before that, some headlines that I am watching this morning. Of course, we're watching this hurricane, another monster storm that is about to slam up into Florida. In that area, they were just hit hard already by Helene, and now this other one's coming in. Might be the worst in 100 years. So we're watching that. Also, a warning from Elon Musk about elections and a heavy push to give illegal immigrants driver's licenses and jobs in the Midwest, and the number of terrorists within our borders right now. We'll get into that, and some new numbers about a battleground state's gubernatorial race 2 years out. Hard to believe it's already heating up for 2026. So we'll get a bit into that. But before we get to Patrick, just a reminder to chime in. Make a comment, ask some questions in the comments section of whatever platform you're watching on. It could be right now live. If it's live, it's Facebook, it's YouTube, it's X. And of course, later on, we'll be on our various platforms as well, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts as well. Love to hear from you. Also, the best way you can help us here at Tom Jordan Live is simply to subscribe free of charge on YouTube or Facebook, X. YouTube is one of the more popular ones. So if you go on there, subscribe free, and then click that notification bell so we can alert you when we get new content out there. All right, I want to get into this. Some headlines here, and I want to talk about this hurricane. It's a nasty storm. Hurricane Milton is shaping up to be this historic and potentially catastrophic storm for Florida's west central coast, as evacuations are now underway from that area. A lot of them are fleeing to the east side of the state. So the National Hurricane Center is warning of life-threatening impacts like we just saw last week, including these deadly storm surges, destructive winds, torrential rainfall. Millions of Floridians are now under these mandatory evacuation orders. They're scrambling to leave their homes before the Category 4, now Category 5 hurricane makes landfall near Tampa, Florida. This thing is a monster, and they're very concerned about the storm surge there. So Governor Ron DeSantis has declared the state of emergency once again. President Biden has approved some federal assistance there. Airports have begun shutting down. 9 o'clock, I think, was in Tampa. So just a few minutes ago, that airport is now shut down. Schools obviously are closed as the state is now bracing for what could be one of the most destructive hurricanes in recent history. We look at this hurricane, Milton, the critical role of federalism in disaster management. One of the purposes of the federal government is to help in this. So we got some state leadership here under Governor Ron DeSantis doing a great job. He knows what he's doing because he's been through this. It's not his first rodeo or his trip around the block. He's done this. So his work here, pretty essential for the quick responses, but the federal assistance is pretty crucial as well to support the overwhelmed resources on a very local level there. And we've heard about FEMA and the problems FEMA is having with even getting into the Carolinas and responding to the needs in real time that are there. This hurricane, Milton now, the second one, is just showing the real importance of personal responsibility in disaster preparedness. And what I mean by that is like, listen, if you're in a hurricane zone, you know something has happened. Listen, board up your windows. If you can, get out, heed the evacuation orders. Because if you don't, it just further strains the resources that are already limited in that area. So Joe Biden, he's approved these federal resources. All of that is necessary, of course, but the true test is going to be how efficiently that aid is distributed, because these bureaucratic delays that we've been seeing, it's significantly hindering the recovery efforts. When the federal government takes this long to distribute aid, in these most affected areas of this hurricane. And then you don't need all the climate hysteria either. The comments that come out from this current administration saying this is all related to man-made climate. They don't know that. They cannot point to any piece of evidence that shows that. And some might try to politicize this storm, which is what they're doing by tying it to climate change hysteria. While extreme weather events occur, it's, I think, critical not to politicize this and to overlook the advancements in storm prediction and the responses that have saved countless lives in recent years. And you look at the exorbitant cost of these hurricanes, the damage, it's different than it was 100 years ago. We saw monster storms back then, but the damage is exponentially worse in terms of economically and the cost because of all the buildings and whatnot have come up in the past, decades in that area. So anyway, we're watching this very closely. We probably all know, most of us do anyway, with people that live down there, from Milton, raising all the concerns about the economic burden that comes from rebuilding. And listen, my wife and I took a trip down there, it was last winter. We looked at the storm damage from, 3 years ago when that storm came through places like, Fort Myers and Fort Myers Beach. They're still rebuilding that. So we're going to be looking at that, watching that very closely as this pushes through, and tomorrow night might be the big night. There is a big debate tonight in one of the most watched U.S. Senate races in the country. It's Republican Mike Rogers and Democrat Alyssa Slotkin going at it tonight in Grand Rapids. I think Wood TV is the host of this debate. It'll be likely moderated by Rick Albom. He's a very well-known political reporter in that region on the west side of the state of Michigan. And so in this race for Michigan's U.S. Senate seat, the Democrat there, Alyssa Slotkin, she has a narrow lead over Mike Rogers, but is beginning to shrink. It's a 3.5% lead over the Republican. Mike Rogers, a former congressman, he was the chair of the National Intelligence Committee, the House Intelligence Committee, when he served, I think it was 12 years in Congress. It is going to be heated, I believe, this debate tonight, as Election Day approaches, and the window is shrinking between these two. About 5% of voters still undecided in this race. That's according to this new poll that was put up by the Detroit News and WDIV Television. That is the NBC affiliate in Detroit, Michigan. Slotkin's support comes from about 47%, 46.8%, more accurately, of likely voters, while Rogers is at 43.3%. Again, about a 3.5-point lead for Alyssa Slotkin. It's within the margin of error. It's 4% margin of error in this poll. So it is very, very close. Rogers has made a lot of gains since August. Slotkin's earlier 8.5-point lead, he's cut it in half. Both of these candidates will debate tonight, and then they're going to debate again a week from tonight, which is obviously an effort to sway those remaining undecided voters. Here is some of, I think, Alyssa Slotkin's vulnerability on policy issues. She's refuting it now, but Alyssa Slotkin has gone 100% in on these Biden-era electric vehicle mandates. And it's very unpopular now. It wasn't 2-3 years ago when she voted for all of this, but now she's claiming she doesn't support it, but she always has. And it's proving to be increasingly unpopular among the Michigan voters in her state. And Rogers, I think, can capitalize on this by highlighting the economic strain that these policies place on middle-class families. And one of the issues we will talk about is this brand new report by Anderson Economic Group that shows exactly how much it costs for an individual to own and operate an electric vehicle. A lot of independents are on play here. Alyssa Slotkin may have a slight edge with the independent voters, very slight, but many are now still undecided. And Mike Rogers' focus on the economic issues, particularly inflation and the cost of fuel and energy, could win over those who are disillusioned, you might say, with Democratic policies. And by the way, I have to say this again, because it's important to remind people, Alyssa Slotkin has portrayed herself as a moderate. She is a far left progressive Democrat. If you just simply look at her voting record, Slotkin is being framed, I think accurately so by me and by Mike Rogers, as a far left congresswoman, which would put her out of touch with Michigan's, centrist and blue collar voters. So Mike Rogers will need tonight to keep emphasizing that point about who she really is to appeal to the moderates in the state and some of the swing voters as well. And the economic message is going to really resonate. Rogers' messaging around economic recovery and reducing government overreach aligns with the concerns of many different voters, particularly those in rural areas of Michigan and now college-educated men, a demographic he's steadily winning over, the college-educated men in the state of Michigan. And by the way, abortion rights, some say that's being overplayed by Alyssa Slotkin, like this is some big threat that if she doesn't win is somehow going to, it has zero impact on what's going to happen with the abortion issue. In fact, Slotkin leans heavily on this abortion rights issue. Polling suggests that the economy and immigration are more important issues for Michigan voters, and I would suspect in most states in the country right now. So Mike Rogers should probably tonight continue prioritizing those topics, immigration and the economy, to resonate with the voters who see, past the single issue focus. And by the way, nothing will change as regards to abortion if either Mike Rogers or Alyssa Slotkin wins this race. Looking out to 2026, I know it's a little early to do that, but is it? Because there's a new poll that's already being done that shows U.S. Representative John James and 2022 gubernatorial candidate Tudor Dixon in a tight race for the GOP's pick for the 2026 governor's race of that state in Michigan. John James, a representative from a town called Shelby Township, he's got 28% support right now, while Tudor Dixon, former Steel executive, she's a mother of four. She's also she's got current talk show host right now. She has her own podcast, Tudor Dixon Podcast, but she was also with Real America's Voice for quite some time with Steve Gruber hosting a program on there, an hour long, I think it was about an hour, maybe 2 hours long, political kind of affairs type of program. But she's the former Steel executive. She is close behind John James, 27%, so 27 to 28. And then you look at the Democratic side of this. Former Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg is leading the Democratic field with 38% of the vote. Pete Buttigieg now lives in a town called Traverse City in the state of Michigan, moved up from, where was he the mayor of? South Bend, Indiana. So he's now up in Traverse City. He's on the Democratic side, he is far ahead of Michigan's Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who right now polls at 18%. So we'll be watching this, of course, for the next couple of years. Hard to believe we're already talking about this. The poll, I think, also kind of highlights the kind of neck-and-neck contest between, former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris. That's very close. Trump leads Harris by just 1 percentage point in this two-way race in Michigan, 49 to 48%. And in this expanded field, the two are tied at 47%. It is a fiercely competitive election season right now in this battleground state of Michigan. So the GOP is going to have a bit of a dilemma as they're looking at John James and they're looking at Tudor Dixon. They both are amongst Republicans. They are pretty popular in the state. John James has high favorability numbers as it relates to Republicans, and of course Tudor Dixon the same as well, and she's the former gubernatorial candidate. Also watching this, Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, I know a lot of Michigan news today, she is pushing for the Drive Safe bill, which would allow illegal immigrants to obtain driver's licenses in the state of Michigan. Gretchen Whitmer, she described this move as crucial for the future. Crucial, framing it as like a part of a broader vision for the state's future workforce. That's what Governor Whitmer said. The future workforce of Michigan is illegal immigrants. So the state's future workforce, illegal immigration. And that's why they're pushing for this. Who are going to replace Michigan's citizens is, I guess, what she's saying here. She expects this bill, which is currently moving through the state legislature, to be a priority when lawmakers return this fall. Right now, they're not in session for the most part, but the bill could open the door to 55,000 new driver's licenses within 3 years for illegal immigrants. Governor Whitmer's comments, they came during this interview celebrating National Hispanic Heritage Month. I love National Hispanic Heritage Month. I grew up in a town that was heavily Hispanic, and that's not the issue. It's the issue with the illegal immigrants coming over, Hispanic or otherwise. But she's trying to emphasize the importance of this measure for undocumented individuals. She brings it up there because she's making the assumption that, all Hispanic voters are undocumented, and a lot of them do not support this. They came in here the right way in this country. They spent time getting the proper visas or U.S. citizenship, and now a lot of others are coming from those former countries in which they used to live, getting all the stuff for free. So these proponents of this bill, they argue that it would provide essential identification and mobility, while the critics are concerned about the legal and the security implications of this. Well, let's talk about that. The legal and security concerns. By issuing driver's licenses to illegal immigrants, the state could be incentivizing illegal immigration. Of course they are, which further erodes the rule of law. It encourages individuals to bypass legal pathways to residency. And by the way, do you think some of these are going to vote? Because there's a voter fraud risk. Granting driver's licenses to illegal immigrants increases the risk of voter fraud, as it could create opportunities for these individuals to improperly register to vote. Doesn't that undermine election integrity that everyone says they're all for? There's also the economic burden of this. The potential influx of 55,000 newly licensed individuals could strain Michigan's infrastructure, the social services, undoubtedly. There's limited resources in the state. The policy might redirect funds away from legal residents who are already facing a whole slew of challenges. That seems to be the theme going around this country. Rediverting funds from the legal U.S. citizens to illegal immigrants. We're seeing that right now, as I mentioned, Hurricane Milton and Hurricane Helene, how some of these FEMA funds are no longer available because a lot of those funds were used to house and to care for and provide insurance, those kinds of things, to illegal immigrants around this country. There is also the public safety issue. The opponents of this bill to grant driver's license to illegal immigrants, they argue that granting these licenses to those who are in the country illegally could undermine public safety. That's a nice way of putting it. Proper background checks and accountability measures, they're not going to be as rigorous. Oh, he's got his ID, he's good. Or she, whatever it works out to be. And then you've got to think about immigration law, the laws that are on the books right now. This undermines all of those laws. Enabling illegal immigrants to obtain official identification effectively normalizes illegal residency. And it's a slippery slope where this distinction between legal and illegal immigration becomes blurred, which weakens overall immigration policy enforcement. So we're watching that as well, and it's not just Michigan. It's happening in Minnesota, California, of course, does this. A lot of states around the country are saying this is the right thing to do. We want to give them mobility. Why do you want to give them mobility? So they can kind of tool around and get out of, get away, and still continue in hiding. A lot of them are right now. All right, so there's this newly released report from the U.S. House Committee on Homeland Security, and it reveals, in relation to illegal immigration, this growing terror threat within the United States. Over 50 jihadist cases have been identified right now across 29 different states. So these are cases spanning from April of 2021 to September of 2024. These attempts by foreign jihadist networks and homegrown extremists to support groups like ISIS, Hezbollah, and Al-Qaeda. You've heard of them. So this committee that put this together points to these failed U.S. It started off with a failed withdrawal from Afghanistan, is what they're saying, because a lot of them from there, members of the Taliban and the rise of Al-Qaeda and ISIS in that region, a lot of them are coming across the border. And then you got the recent October 7th, Hamas attacks. It was a year ago yesterday when that occurred, as these events have intensified the terror threats in this country. There's a big call for stronger leadership amongst these House Intelligence Committees and these investigative committees. We need stronger leadership around the world. And this report that just came out is saying basically there is an urgent need for a policy shift to protect the homeland from these persistent dangers. Department of Homeland Security is saying we are much more secure. So let's look at that failed Afghan withdrawal, that disastrous exit from Afghanistan. Under the Biden-Harris administration, it directly, they say, emboldened jihadist groups like ISIS, and it signals the American weakness across the world, sparking the current surge in terrorist activities. You'd have to close your eyes to not notice what's happening internationally as it relates to this and the threat now against this country. And then you look at the border vulnerabilities, which is seen right there. Barbed wire fence, they're just walking right around it. And Joe Biden pretends he's securing our border. But these are open border policies that have become a national security risk as these jihadists exploit the porous southern border. So there's a growing likelihood of these foreign extremists entering the United States, and they're not being noticed. That's the scary part. There's a lot here, they believe. They have no idea who they are, where they've come from, and where they are currently located in this country. And you think about the terrorist threat, the weak leadership on terrorism, the current administration's passive response to growing jihadist threats, including reluctance to admit policy failures, leaves America exposed to both foreign and domestic extremists. And by the way, the domestic extremists, despite what Joe Biden has told you, is not the Republican Party. That was a partisan speech he made while president of the United States. There needs to be more DHS, Department of Homeland Security Accountability. This department, is established. Remember this? It was established after 9/11 to prevent terrorism. They have failed in that primary mission. And they've seen its inability to track and to screen high-risk non-citizens effectively. And now there are these rising threats post-Hamas attacks. This rising threat over the past year, the October 7th Hamas attacks, not only destabilized the Middle East, but also reverberated in the United States. And you see the heightened threats against Jewish communities and American citizens at home. And there are constant anti-Israel, anti-United States protests calling for the elimination of Israel, and in some case, the overthrowing of the United States. We saw that in Michigan, in Dearborn, Michigan. That's what some of the chants were about, overthrowing this country. Those protests occurring on a regular basis. All right. You probably saw this in Butler, Pennsylvania, a billionaire tech entrepreneur, Elon Musk. He is now a Trump supporter. Remember, this guy was a Democrat a few years ago, but now he's supporting Trump actively on the campaign trail. He was with him in Butler, Pennsylvania, and he issued this very stark warning at that Trump rally on Saturday, claiming that if Vice President Kamala Harris wins the 2024 election, it could be the last election. And you say, well, Tom, that's pretty extreme for him to say. Well, the media has been saying that about Donald Trump, mischaracterizing a phrase that he said, urging Christians to vote. A lot of Christians don't normally vote. So he said, just come out this one time. You just do it once and you don't have to vote again. They used that phrase that Donald Trump said, you won't have to vote again, as saying this will be the last election. That wasn't what he was saying. If Kamala Harris wins, the threat is that this might be the last election, according to now the former Democrat, Elon Musk, and he urged the crowd to register to vote and to encourage others to do the same, particularly in these swing states like in Georgia and in Arizona, where the registration deadlines are fast approaching. Got to do it. So Elon Musk's comments, they came as Democrats like former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi continue to claim that, democracy itself is at risk in the upcoming election. So Nancy Pelosi has pointed to the return of Donald Trump as a threat in, citing these attempts on Trump's life as evidence of political violence and division in the country. So they're trying to kill Donald Trump, and she says that's why Donald Trump shouldn't be elected, because Democrats are trying to kill him. So let's vote Democrat. That's seemingly her logic in all of this. So despite all of these dangers, Donald Trump returned to Pennsylvania over the weekend. That place that the assassination attempt on his life took place, and it was packed. The support was immense. You can see the crowds right there. And his supporters were rallied alongside Elon Musk and, of course, the GOP presidential nominee, vice presidential nominee, Senator J.D. Vance. So it was interesting. And you could go back and watch it. I'm sure you can find it on YouTube and whatnot. But it is concerning when you think about this claim by Elon Musk saying this could be the very last election. And he understands probably the threat against free speech than probably a lot of others, because he took over Twitter, renamed it X. But when he took over Twitter, Twitter was one of those very active participants in silencing speech from conservatives. And he had all the documents. He had all the records of that occurring. And thanks to these other formerly, probably still liberal journalists like Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger. Listen, these are liberal individuals. And Barry Weiss came out. They all participated in investigating, as investigative journalists, looking through the Twitter files, and what they found was an orchestrated attempt with Jack, the former owner of Twitter, and the FBI and the Department of Justice going into these private companies, asking them to silence those individuals. All right. I mentioned there's a couple things we're watching on the economy. And let's first talk about last week's potential strike by the International Longshoremen's Association, ILA, which threatened to wreak havoc on major export-heavy states, particularly in the automotive and the manufacturing industries, with states like, South Carolina, Alabama, and Michigan in the crosshairs, so to speak. That ripple effect on the U.S. economy was poised to be very significant. But after these, I guess, pretty intense negotiations and some pretty intense pressure, the International Longshoremen's Association agreed to suspend the strike in exchange for a pretty hefty 60% wage increase, a 60% wage. And then we'll work out the other things come January. So they narrowly avoided this immediate economic crisis. The looming threat of future labor unrest is still out there, and the higher costs for both producers and consumers are almost inevitable. It is going to happen. And the states most affected by these potential disruptions would be South Carolina, Alabama, the state of Michigan, and others as well. And they got a brace right now for these longer-term consequences, including the slower supply chains, the rising inflation that's going to occur as a result, and especially at the U.S. ports that are facing the increase in delays of this, and the inefficiencies, of course, as well. The Anderson Economic Group, they put out an analysis of this and had the opportunity to read through it. And it shows that while the short-term impact of the strike would have been limited, the long-term costs could become a pretty heavy burden for the entire economy. Also, there's another major issue which will undoubtedly impact the cost of living, and the Anderson Economic Group has written extensively about this as well. The cost of cars, likely leading to more economic harm, the rapid transition to electric vehicles and renewable energy. So let's bring in Patrick Anderson, the founder of Anderson Economic Group, and his firm, of course, is watching all of this very closely. We appreciate your time. Patrick Anderson, love reading your stuff. Thanks for your time. Really appreciate it.
Nice to join you, Tom Jordan, live.
Yes, thank you. And it's good to see the bow tie there. I always appreciate that. You're always up and ready to go and address the hard issues economically in this life. And I do want to, if you don't mind, talking about this report that just came out. You just released it at 9 o'clock this morning about electric vehicles. They appear to be the future. But, we think about the exorbitant, upfront costs, and the government steps in and says, I know they're pricey. These electric vehicles are very expensive to buy, but we're going to help you with these tax credits, $7,500,
Yeah.
and then you'll be good to go from there on out. But can you summarize what you found that was just released in this report about 30 minutes ago?
The Anderson Economic Group, as you mentioned, Tom, does a lot of work in the auto industry. So we have auto dealers, we have auto suppliers, we have auto manufacturers, and of course, everyone around us in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, Illinois, states we work in, is either in or near the auto industry. So we look at this really, really carefully. And since 2021, we've calculated the cost of driving comparable electric vehicles and ICE vehicles. So these are the same kind of cars, mid-priced cars, luxury cars, pickup trucks, apples to apples. And what we found in our benchmark state of Michigan is that for people who drive pickup trucks, it is clearly significantly more expensive to drive an electric pickup truck, especially if you have to charge it commercially regularly. For mid-priced cars, it's also a little bit more expensive. For entry-priced cars, it's also a bit more expensive to drive electric cars in terms of the total cost of fueling them and operating them. But for luxury cars, if you can charge at home, luxury car buyers can often save a little money by driving an electric car. And it's a very interesting comparison because that's actually what's happening in the market is a very large share of the electric vehicles that are sold are luxury cars. And their manufacturers are having a very difficult time selling entry priced pickup trucks and even mid priced electric cars.
Yeah, I've talked to some automotive dealers, and they say the very same thing that they just can't get them off their lot, so they're sitting out there, and hopefully there's some deals to be had. I don't know. I looked recently; they seem out of range for me, and I'm like the definition of middle class, so I would imagine that's the same for others as well. But that's just the upfront cost of getting into it, to buying it. When you analyze the actual cost of ownership, let's go down that. Obviously, there's the upfront cost. I think the average is what, like 56,000 or something to buy on
Yeah.
average. About that. So let's talk about that first. How different is that, say, apples to apples comparison to the internal combustion engines?
The electric vehicles have typically been significantly more expensive. The price differential has come down, but it's still 10 or 20% difference, and that's pretty much across the board. Pickup trucks, entry priced vehicles. Actually, the differential is even higher as a percentage basis for entry level vehicles, and that's for the very price sensitive people. If you're buying your first new car, you typically don't want to spend 35 or 40 or even 50,000 for it, which is pretty much what you had to spend to get into an electric car until recently. Now you have, with taxpayer subsidies, lease deals that are heavily subsidized, and that's the spot where you see a lot of growth in electric car sales are taxpayer subsidized leases, and so that's a way that some people are getting into buying electric vehicles and driving them. They don't actually own them. The lease company does, and it gets a taxpayer subsidy. But it's definitely more expensive up front. What we have been calculating, which is harder for people because it's hard for them to see the full price of driving an electric car, where it's fairly easy for them to look at the gas pump and see the cost of driving the car for gas. For the state taxes are already in the price of gasoline. The cost of operating the station's already in the price. But if you drive an electric car, you have to pay separately the state taxes. You have to separately buy a home charger. You have to separately pay for commercial charging. And then you have state taxes on EVs. It's hard to add those up. We do that for you with the Anderson Economic Group fueling cost studies. And those have shown pretty clearly that the one niche where electric vehicles make economic sense for buyers are people who want to buy luxury cars and who have a car, have a garage, and can pay for a charger. For those folks, it makes some sense economically, and for a lot of other drivers, it just doesn't.
No, because that's another unexpected cost that people aren't necessarily thinking about. It's like, okay, I got this taxpayer subsidy, which to me bothers me because we're already paying for electric vehicles, whether we want them or not, as taxpayers, because we're helping to
Yeah.
subsidize these government funded deals to get people into the market because they don't want to buy necessarily the cars in the first place. And one big reason is because they're very, very expensive to do. But then you guys, oh, you got to buy a charger too. And if you want to charge this thing up, especially at a faster pace than what would readily be available to you. So you got different charging systems. That can be anywhere from what, 1,300 to 4 grand alone for something like that, correct?
Yeah, it's the charger that I bought for my electric car 4 years ago was $1,300,
Yeah.
and that's the slow charger. If I want to
Mm.
get it installed, it was over $4,000, and that's and that wouldn't be a full fledged a DC charger. That's an L2 charger at home, and I'm not unusual in that situation. We estimate in the Anderson Economic Group fueling cost study, we estimate that some people buy those, and we expect that they spread the cost over 5 years. So we're not assuming that all that cost is up front. But yeah, if you're going to buy an electric car, you're going to want to try to charge it at home. You probably can't charge it at home all the time, so we estimate some portion of your charging is commercially. But yeah, it's a $1,300, $4,000 is not going to be unusual for a full install. If some people can pay about $700 and just plug it in and get away with it for a while, that's about the low end. But yeah, you got to add those costs, and guess what? Michigan's going to tax you,
Yeah.
uh, as most states will, and a lot of people oblivious to that when they
Well,
buy
that's what I want
electric.
you to get into, the tax aspect of this, because you read different analyses of these type of, what does it really cost to own an electric vehicle? And there's a lot of publications out there. But what you did differently at the Anderson Economic Group is you did factor in the real world expenses when you factor in taxes, because they don't do that. You found out. So, what is the reality? Let's say you're in the state of Michigan. What's the reality of the tax burden on what, and how is that factored in? Is the tax factored in based on how much electricity you're pumping into that vehicle, or is it how does it work?
Very good question, Tom. And you're right. If you go out there and just Google cost of electric car, you see, I mean, kind of ridiculous claims that it's almost costless and it costs almost nothing. Well, guess what? If you drive an electric car or you drive a gas car, you will pay state taxes. We will add those in apples to apples, but unfortunately, most of the things you see on the internet and even the U.S. government's calculations include taxes for gas cars and then omit them for electric cars. It's just not right. If you're in Michigan, like I am, I have an electric car. I've had one for 4 years. I pay about $150 a year for a state of Michigan tax on the EV. If I drive a gas car, which I also do, then I'm paying taxes like 20 cents per gallon, state and federal excise taxes at the gallon, at the pump. Apples to apples as you include them both. We do that. If I go to the gas station, the cost of the gasoline includes the excise taxes and the cost of operating the station. If I charge my electric car, I got to buy my own charger for home. So you got to add that in. And also something that relatively few people are aware of is they know about that for their phone. For example, here's my phone here. If I charge it, it will get hot. I pay extra electricity that gets burned up in heat. Same things happens when you charge your car. So 9 to 11% of the electricity that you buy actually gets burned up in heat when you're charging your car. We
I
count
have
that.
never heard that before. That's
Yeah,
something you never hear. That nine to you said about 10% of what
yeah,
you're paying for, it
yeah,
basically just goes out into the
yeah.
wherever the heavens, and you never see it again.
And this is every engineer knows this. The U.S. government knows this. I mean, it's not.
Wow.
It's not. I mean, anybody, if you don't believe me, plug your phone in and just put it in your hand. If it gets hot, then you should believe me. Right?
It does, yeah.
It's just physics. When you charge batteries, they get hot. So
Yeah.
uh, that's also in there. We include that in the cost, so you can get a really good apples to apples comparison, and you can find that now on the AndersonEconomicGroup.com website.
Great. And I think that's Anderson Econ AEG1.
AndersonEconomicGroup.com. I'll give you
AEG.
right there.
Okay, there you go. Good. All right. What about the cost of electricity? Because here's my assumption, and this is I think a lot of people's assumption as well, or maybe I'm just completely naive. But you think about okay, you're going to drive around, you get to just plug in your vehicle, and it's free energy for your car. But there is an
Yeah,
actual cost to electricity. We know I'm the guy in the house trying to turn off the lights because my kids leave the lights on in the house, but that costs money to leave the lights on. The same is true when you charge your vehicle. Do you know what
yeah,
that compares in terms of gas versus electricity?
yeah. I mean, in Michigan, we pay about 16 cents a kilowatt hour for residential electricity. That changes every quarter, and it's different if you're, in Consumers, Detroit, Edison, different parts of the state. And now you have these, and basically they're pushing you to get on time of day charging. So it's no longer even a cents per kilowatt. It's cents per kilowatt that varies by the time of day. And that's a little complicated, but we do our best here. We quarterly update the cost we have for each state. Now that's about 16 cents. It can be 20 cents. It can be 24 cents. Or sometimes it can be, say, 12 cents if you happen to be in the night and you're able to only charge during that time period. But we give you an estimate based on the average across all the utilities in the state. If you have to charge commercially, which if you drive an electric car, you almost certainly do, that can be 40 cents, 50 cents, 60 cents. That's very hard for people to figure out often when they go to a commercial charging station. We do an estimate, a fairly sophisticated method to try to estimate some real world costs. But I would advise people to pay close attention when they go to commercial charging stations. Try to figure out how much you're actually paying. For some people, they'd be quite surprised to see how much it is.
Yeah, I would be surprised. I would think so. And I'm curious. You've had an electric vehicle now for a while, and so I'm sure you're using some of those public charging facilities and whatnot. How does
Yeah.
that work? You don't just plug it in and don't pay. You got to what, stick in your debit card in there somehow? Is that how it works?
Well, I'm not going to shock anyone who drives an electric car, but often the question is not how does it work, but does it work?
Does it
Uh,
work?
Yeah, I mean, and when we first started writing about this, Tom, in 2021, people were shocked when we would write this. We say a serious problem is showing up at commercial charging stations and they don't work.
Hmm.
I mean, when I say don't work, I mean they literally don't work. You can't connect with it. It somehow just goes blank on you. Now that's well known. There's been studies where, like, I think in Los Angeles, they found something like 30 or 40% at any one time didn't work for one reason or another, and that's strongly affecting people's willingness. I mean, myself, many times I had serious issues with getting chargers to work. Uh, at home, almost all the time it works, but may take some time jiggering with it.
Hmm.
Now I'll say the reliability's improved, but this is something that a lot of electric vehicles, new drivers, new ones, are shocked at the fact that they don't just show up. It's not just like a pump where you put the pump in, 5 minutes later you're on the road. That's not the electric vehicle charging experience.
Hmm.
And people who buy electric vehicles should be aware of that, because for some folks, that's fine. They're willing to spend the time. They have the flexibility in their schedule. They're comfortable learning new applications. And for some people, that's a real problem in their life and their responsibilities for kids or for their family or for getting to a job. And we need to be frank with people about that and not try to push them into something that doesn't meet their lifestyle.
Are people starting to wake up to this, do you think? Because now I'm seeing certain politicians, and I won't name them right now because this is not a political segment. This just has to do with electric
Yeah.
vehicles, and we're going to get into longshoremen in a bit. But a lot of politicians whom I know have been very, very vocally supportive of what they would call mandates to switch over to all electric vehicle by 2035. And they were pushing for this very publicly. This is the right and convenient thing to do. But now that people are realizing, well, no, it's not. It's not convenient for sure, and certainly not less expensive. And maybe it's not all that good for the environment. And plus, I don't think the grid is ready for this. So I'm going to hold back on that. As that information is coming out, there are a lot of politicians saying, well, I don't support that. I believe in choice. I'm
Yeah.
pro-choice when it comes to which vehicle you can drive. What does that indicate to you? That people are waking up and maybe we're pushing this thing too quickly?
Definitely the difference I can see in the last 4 years. I mean, we had people just harshly criticize us, especially on Twitter and online. Like, you live near Detroit. That was the one that I was like, I can't believe you're saying this. Don't you know that every Detroit-based automaker is heavily investing in electric vehicles? And wouldn't it be a good idea for people that know about the auto industry to look at this? But now, I mean, we used to, for example, our first report in 2021, we noted the problems with reliability of chargers. Now everyone knows that. I mean, you can see basically the decision by Ford and General Motors and others to say, all right, we're going to make a deal with Tesla to use their more reliable network is an admission of that. The ripping out of a lot of the older chargers, such at Electrify America places, is an admission of that. And even in the Inflation Reduction Act, which you've criticized and I have too, for the extraordinary subsidies going in one direction, requires some kind of reliability metrics. You don't hear people saying, I want to go to that gas station because it's a little more reliable than the other one. I mean,
Right.
people assume. I actually kept track. I've had one time in a decade. one time in this decade have I gone to a gas station, put in my credit card, tried to pump, and it wouldn't work. One time in a decade.
And what
I
did
have
you do? You probably went to the next pump right next to
right, right.
it.
And I can tell you, I mean, when I'm driving an electric car, it can be one time a day where I get to a one that doesn't work. Yeah,
Wow. Oh, I didn't know
yeah,
it was that severe.
yeah.
So
I
this
mean,
is
it's
common knowledge.
pretty
Yeah.
significant. And if you don't believe me, pull up PlugShare, one of the other apps, and they actually have reliability ratings because it's so well known among the electric car drivers that they actually have crowdsourced reliability ratings about which pumps work and which ones don't.
Have you noticed, and then I'll move on to the port strike here, but have you noticed, are there differences in insurance rates when you're talking about an electric vehicle and a gas car?
I don't think that's started to occur, but we think that's almost certain to occur. And when I say I don't think it's started to occur, I haven't observed it yet in the market for insurance for consumer car driving. It has started to occur in shipping and other things like that, which is something we've alerted to. I mean, this is literally a life and death issue for people who are in boats. And we when the I think it was the Fremantle Ace and the Fremantle and the Felicity Ace 2 years ago that were modern freighters coming out of Europe, caught fire almost right, like almost immediately after
Mm,
leaving port.
mm,
Electric vehicles were involved in the fires. They could not put them out. The first ship sank. I
mm.
mean, sank completely. The second one was towed into port before it was able to avoid sinking it. But people died on the second ship. I mean, it's a serious problem. You already have collapse of a parking structure outside an airport in Britain, and which was a car fire that hit electric vehicles. It's a life or death and safety issue already. So you should expect that you're going to see insurance differences in the future.
Yeah, and I'll be honest with you, that to me is one of my biggest concerns in purchasing an electric vehicle is the explosive nature of these vehicles. And a friend of mine just drove by a house the other day. I was on the phone and drove by a house. There was a electric vehicle in the garage. It was just well, I don't know what it looks like now, like a engine block, basically left over, and the house had burned down around it.
Oh,
And I know down these hurricane when salt water. I've talked to somebody the other day who's an engineer at one of these automakers and says, listen, when salt water combines mixes with an electric vehicle, the lithium battery, what happens is it explodes. And we know that as engineers, we see that in our, plants and whatnot. But now in the real world, when a hurricane comes in down in Florida or in Georgia, wherever it's hitting now, that's what they're experiencing as well. And that's not really, I don't think, widely known either.
the fire risk, and you can see on I myself said we issued a plea. I don't have any legal authority here, but let me say as an industry leader, sometimes people I think listen to folks like me that say we got a real problem after the Felicity Ace disaster,
Hmm.
and now the second one where people died. I mean, we definitely have an issue. It's this most recent hurricane. It's not the first time we've had. There was flooding in Florida, especially about a year or two ago, and exactly what you said happened. There were a bunch of electric vehicles that got submerged. Now, that's just a bad. Submerging a vehicle is bad for any vehicle. So I'm not going to tell you that you can do what they do in the movies where you
Right.
go in the water and come out. That's a very bad thing for cars. Many of them. I mean, it's a very you have to put on your title. Don't submerge your vehicles, ladies and gentlemen. Do not
Right.
drive in the
Yeah.
water or park where you can get inundated. But if it's an electric car with a big battery, you do have a risk, a highly increased risk of what they call thermal runaway afterwards. I won't say it explodes, but you have a very serious risk of battery issues, including fires
Yeah.
afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, no one wants to submerge their vehicle, gas or electric, but the gas cars are not catching fire when water mixes with it. You think the exact opposite would happen, but with the EVs, whatever you call it, thermal, whatever you said,
Thermal
or
runaway. That's
thermal
the word.
runaway, it looks like an explosion to lay people like myself, or fires, whatever it is. It's dangerous, pretty dangerous. I do want to get to this port strike that when I
Yeah.
say we, the United States economy averted last week, but there are still some concerning things about it. And I know you've written about this, and we talked about this. The agreement on the wage issue, it was a pretty steep increase, 60% they've agreed to. And that'll be taken away, I think, January 15th if they don't come to terms on all the other issues. That's the deadline on it, and that'll be taken away. But in the meantime, that in and of itself, how does that impact, in your view, what you've discovered, the overall economy?
Our estimate for the longshoremen's union strike against the Gulf and East Coast ports was it would cost about $2.1 billion for a 1 week strike. $2.1 billion spread across um, much of the eastern half of the United States. There's some effects also outside of that, but a lot of it was in export areas and along the ports. That's a significant amount of money, but it's nowhere near what was threatened and what they were using to try to pressure President Biden to intervene with the Taft-Hartley effort. There's an estimate out there of $5 billion a day. I will say that's I'll say what I said last time this happened. I say to cost that much money, you have to sink the ships.
Hmm.
A port strike doesn't sink the ships; it just leaves them out there, which is expensive,
Yeah.
and it causes all the agricultural and food products to spoil. But it's not the same thing as sinking the ships. And so it was a $2 billion estimated loss spread across much of the U.S. economy for a week. There were a lot of drumbeat of pressure. President Biden, in particular, pressured the port operators. He was very concerned, as evidenced by the full story in the Washington Post about the effort that he made, because like it's 1 month from the election. They don't want any disruption,
Hmm.
and it was explicit there. This was a political risk to them,
Hmm.
as well as a normal risk to the economy, pressured the port operators to agree to a 60% plus wage increase, and the strike's not over. It's just postponed till after the election. So we could be
Yeah.
back facing this in January, as you said.
Yeah. And I know it's going to have, at least the port strike, different impacts on different states. I think with South Carolina, Alabama, they're very reliant on these exports and whatnot. Michigan, a
Yeah.
little bit different. Some of the same challenges as the rest of the auto industry, but these are manufacturing states as well. So that alone is going to have an impact. If they don't reach an agreement in January, have we essentially just kicked the can down the road? Because do you think they will reach an agreement on these other really serious issues? Automation's a big deal, and if you're running a company, you have the opportunity to automate. That reduces costs, but I know that the union doesn't want that to happen because automation means fewer jobs. What do you think is going to happen there?
Well, it's clearly kicking a can down the road, and it's actually paying money and then kicking a can down the road, and it's still there. So we have this situation where, with enormous political pressure, because it was an election year and it was explicit, and I'm not conjecturing here. It's quite clear that President Biden and the White House did not want a disruption right before the election, and that's why they pressured, a major reason they pressured these folks. Uh, uh, and they agreed to a 60% increase. By the way, the average salary for ILA workers is something around $150,000. So we're not talking about
Wow.
this is
Yeah.
substantially more than UAW workers, substantially more than most workers in the hospitality and agriculture industries. These are some of the highest paid workers in the United States. Doesn't mean they can't ask for more. I believe that workers and management can negotiate these things and should have the right to do that. But that's what the 60% wage increase is on top of. And for those of us in states like Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, South Carolina, Alabama, Texas, Mississippi, Florida, that export a substantial portion of what we make through ports on the East Coast, whether or not ports are efficient matters to us, and the costs matter to us. So it's definitely expensive here, and we don't know the full bill.
Well, I heard Vice President Kamala Harris the other day. She was standing, in full support of the workers in this and say they need to be given what is fair. What I didn't hear her say was $150,000 annual salary is just not fair. I didn't hear her bring that up. And to me, when I forgot about that high salary that these workers are already earning right now. And that's conveniently left out of the conversation here. So let's say they got the 60% on top of that increase over, I forget the duration,
Yeah,
maybe 6 years.
again, it's at least 60%, and the strike's not over.
Right. So it could go to 80 is what they wanted. They wanted about 77%, I think, over a 6 year period. So that's going to further exacerbate, I think, the inflationary impact of this strike. And then we're not even talking about the supply chain issue. So I guess one final comment on that. What is the risk now to the supply chain? And could we see ourselves in a similar situation that we were in about 3 years ago?
I don't think we're going to see the situation we're in 3 years ago for a long time, and I sure hope not. And I believe you're talking about
Supply.
essentially government forced shutdown of much of the economy during the pandemic, and we have to give some allowance for what we knew and didn't know at the time. But it is quite clear that you had government excess, in particular in Michigan, on that, and uh, we all, I mean, people just, it's a funny thing where people don't want to talk about it because it was so bad.
Yeah.
And but I hope we never see that again. But supply chain problems we are seeing, and the fact that the ILA, one union, could have such a threatened effect on the economy, and have put the White House basically into a tizzy. And we're talking about wars are going on in the world, and serious issues are out there about our economy, about inflation, about, and at local level, I mean, our schools and other things. And yet, one of the most important things was we need to just not have this one union strike and shut down imports for more than a couple of days. We couldn't take it. I'm, as a citizen and somebody, I'm a little concerned about that. And from a state like Michigan, where our exports are really important, uh, putting ourselves in a situation where we have some of the least efficient, most costly ports, and we're kind of stuck with that, with a threat of a strike, is a real risk that we need to deal with. And Michigan's a little less insulated than Alabama. For example, Alabama built a lot of cars now, and they export from East Coast ports. We have the St. Lawrence Seaway. We have rail and other things, so we're not as vulnerable. But still, our auto industry is important. A lot of our suppliers out there, people listening to this show that work for suppliers that sell to a whole bunch of OEMs, they're affected by this. And Michigan farmers, agriculture, that's a big part of our economy. They need to be able to export. And so these costs matter to them, and supply chain risks matter to them.
Well, you just outlined just some of the arenas and the industries that will be impacted by this continuing and lengthening out labor dispute. You mentioned farmers, and that's a whole nother arena we can go into. But I've taken up enough of your time, and I really appreciate you as always. Patrick Anderson is the founder and the guy in charge at Anderson Economic Group. You should read his stuff. Go to his website, Anderson Economic Group, or go on his LinkedIn. I read a lot of your stuff on LinkedIn. It's phenomenal. People should take that opportunity to do so. Patrick, it's so good to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Great to join you, Tom.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day. And I want to thank our listeners for spending time with us today. Remember, you can, if you want to watch this again, by all means, please do. It's available throughout the day, I think, in perpetuity. I think we're going to make this available. If you didn't catch it on this platform, YouTube or Facebook or X, it's also available if you want to watch it later or share it on Spotify and also on Apple Podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and hit that notification icon so we can remind you we got more content on the platform. Come on back. Stop what you're doing. Take another peek at Tom Jordan Live. Listen, God bless you. Thank you for your time. We'll catch you back here tomorrow.